Hi, welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, I am going to show you some basic examples of CSS selectors so you can get started with CSS. Now we have linked an external CSS file and we can write CSS inside this style.css file and it will be applied to this index.html file. In this lecture, I just want to show you some basic CSS selectors. Let us play with some basic CSS. Right now I have this h1 element and I want to apply some CSS to this h1 element. So I'm going to take this h1 element as an example. I'm going to apply some CSS to this h1 element, and for that I'll move to style.css. Before I write any CSS inside this CSS file, I want to show you how you can write comments inside CSS file. To write comment inside CSS file, you write / and then you write star, and after that you write comment like basic CSS selectors examples. And after writing comment, you write star and then /. By this way you write comments inside CSS file. Okay, now I am going to apply some CSS to this h1 element. To apply CSS to that h1 element, I am going to write the CSS selector for h1 element, which is h1, and after that opening and closing curly braces, and inside these braces I am going to write CSS declaration. I want to set the color for this h1 element, and for color I am going to write CSS color property, and after that I am going to write colon, and after that I am going to write CSS value for this color property. I want to set the color for this h1 element to be green. So I will write green and then I will end this line with semicolon. I'll go ahead, I'll save these changes, and I'm going to open this index.html file inside the web browser. And for that I'm going to click on this open in browser extension icon. As you can see, the color for this h1 element is green. So by this way you can apply CSS to this h1 element. I'm going to inspect this h1 element and I'll show you the CSS rule set for this h1 element inside the Chrome Developer Tools. As you can see that this h1 element is selected under the Elements tab, and you can see custom CSS rule set for this h1 element under the Styles pane. Next I want to set the font size for this h1 element. For font size, I am going to write CSS font size property and I'll set it to 45 pixels. I'll go ahead, I'll save these changes again, and I'm going to refresh this web page, and you can see that the font size for this h1 element is 45 pixels. You can play around with these values inside the Chrome Developer Tools. Okay, next I want to show you a second example. I'll go to index.html file and I'm going to add p element as an example. I'm going to apply some CSS to this p element. To apply CSS to this p element, I have to first select this p element inside the CSS file, and I'm going to write the CSS selector for p element, which is simply p and then opening and closing curly braces, and then I'll write CSS declaration for this p element inside these curly braces. I want to set the background color for this p element, and for background color I'm going to write CSS background color property and I'll set it to pink. Next I'm going to set the text color for this p element, and the color should be white. This is hexa value for white color. And after that I am going to set the font size for this p element, and the value for font size should be 20 pixels. I'll go ahead, I'll save these changes, and I'm going to refresh this web page, and you can see that there is a paragraph, and the background color for this paragraph is pink, and the text color for this p element is white, and the font size for this p element is 20 pixels. I am going to select this p element under the Elements tab, and you can see the rule sets for this P element under the styles pane. Next, I want to show you one last example of basic CSS selectors. I will go to index.html file and I'm going to add div element. The div element defines a division or a section in an HTML document. Inside this div element, I am going to add P element, and this P element will be actually inside div. I'll go ahead, I'll save these changes, and I'm going to refresh this web page, and you can see that now we have second paragraph. Actually, this paragraph is inside the div element, and this paragraph has same style as we have for the first paragraph because we have applied some CSS to the P element inside the style.css. These ones, okay? So now I want to target this P element which is inside this div element. So how we can apply CSS to this P element which is actually inside the div element? Let me show you. For that, you need to write div, and inside this div we have P element, and then opening and closing curly braces, and we will declare CSS for this P element which is inside the div element. I will copy these CSS and I will duplicate them for this P element. I want the background color for this P element to be red and the text color should be black. This is the hexa value for black color, and the font size should be 40 pixels. So these CSS will be applied only to this P element which is inside div element. I'll go ahead, I'll save these changes, and I'm going to refresh this web page, and now you can see that there is red background for this second paragraph, and the text color for this second paragraph is black, and the font size for this paragraph is 40 pixels. And you can clearly see the rule set for this P element which is inside the div element under the styles pane. So by this way you can apply CSS to any element which is inside some element, okay? So these were just an examples of basic CSS selectors. By this way you can select the elements and you can apply CSS rules. Okay, in this lecture I just wanted to show you some basic CSS selectors, and these were just an examples, and I will delete these examples because we don't need them, and I will keep the example markup. Okay, please go ahead and play around with some basic CSS selectors, and if you have any question, please ask me. I would be glad to help you. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next class.